Good evening, everybody. We're really glad that you could join us. My name is Evan Mason. I'm a volunteer and a board member of Green Home New York. And I want to make sure that everybody can hear me. I'm a board member of Green Home New York, and full disclosure, I'm also a board member of New York League of Conservation Voters. And I want to just welcome you. I know there's a lot going on in this world, and it's tough to keep in mind everything that is going on and how it relates to the environment and to the elections and to the upcoming primaries, which will take place on June 23rd. I also really want to thank Greg Thomas, Jenny Nichols, who are the co-leaders and working behind the scenes to keep us up and running, and Harris Krismanich, who is helping me also and who will manage the transitions between the speakers. Unfortunately, Essie Alam-Hensey will not be able to join us. She had a family emergency. And so you will know that Josh and Cecil both have an incredible breadth of knowledge, and also are very fluent with the tongue. And so they're going to lead us kind of in a discussion, but unfortunately Essie can't join us. As many of you know, Green Home New York is an all-volunteer 501c3 organization dedicated to promoting an energy efficient and sustainable built environment. We have been active in improving living situations and affordable housing through education and training to improve energy efficiency, ventilation, water quality, health and safety, and housing across the board. Somebody's texting me, so I just want to see what it is. Anyway, tonight's program will focus on the political process, inform participants as to where candidates stand on the environment, what environmental legislation is likely to come to a vote this year, and in the state and the city generally, and help us become more informed about who our representatives are, how they actually vote, and work to advance pro-environmental policy and legislation. So we're going to launch a poll real quick, and I have to find my screen. Before we go on to our poll, I just want to let you know that we're going to have a policy forum on July 15th, Green Home New York is, and we're also going to have a careers meetup on vocational green careers and green jobs and how to get into the field. That will be on June 7th, and it will be virtually through Zoom. Harris, can you put up the poll? It's a basic question, yes or no question. Do you think it is important to vote? It may seem like a silly question, but if you can put in what you think, it would be great, because there's some people think that if voting were to have made the difference, we wouldn't be in the situation we are in today. So this is interesting because it looks like all of you think it's important to vote. So maybe we're preaching to the choir here. So Josh Kleinberg is the Senior Vice President of the New York State League of Conservation Voters. Josh has played a key role in many statewide and local level nonpartisan voter engagement campaigns, candidate forums, ballot initiatives, issue campaigns, lobbying efforts, and independent expenditure campaigns. He leads New York League of Conservation voter endorsements process, where all candidates in New York State and New York City are surveyed and scored based on how they work to combat climate change and how they actually follow through and vote on environmental policy and legislation. I also want to note that both the League of Conservation Voters and Green Home New York City are nonpartisan, but we are pro-environment. So I just wanted to make sure that everybody understands that we're 501c3s and we are nonpartisan. And Cecil Corbin-Mark is Deputy Director and Director of Policy Initiatives at We Act for Environmental Justice. prior to working at WEACT, Cecil worked for the Bronx Community District Attorney's Office. He's just an incredibly strong environmental advocate and an advocate for environmental justice. And we're just really blessed and honored to have him and Josh join us. So with that, we'll turn it over to Josh's PowerPoint. I think you're going to be able to screen share. We can see, we got it?
Yeah, I'm going to do so in just a moment. Just wanted to thank you, Evan, for welcoming me back to Green Home. I had the privilege of sharing the stage with Cecil a couple of years ago for a similar event. And I'm delighted to be here, not only because you asked me, Evan, but also it's a great organization. And I'm also very much appreciative and touched that the organization is continuing to honor my friend and former classmate, Patty Noonan. She and I were classmates at NYU Wagner. Terrific person, and it's just a great and fitting tribute to her that you are memorializing her in terms of the policy discussions that you're having. So I'm always touched to be here. Let me share my screen here with you, because I've prepared a slide deck here to discuss the nexus between politics and policy right now within the state of New York. I just need to pull up here the excuse me for just one second, the command that allows me to go into the slideshow. Forgive me for 1 second. Should have practiced this before. Here we go, slideshow from the beginning. Okay, so there's been a lot going on, as was noted, in terms of politics and policy over the last few months. And whenever you're coming to an election, you always have to take a look at where you've been to know where you're going. You also have to be very much in the moment and understand what is going on to see how those last minute changes and those calibrations to affect the outcome. Going back, every election is a cycle, right? So we're coming into the 2020 election cycle. The last election cycle that was similar here was in 2018, where it was very much a reaction to the election of 2016, here in New York, at least, where, we saw a little bit of a blue wave come about in state level races, with the state Senate flipping for the first time in a very long time, in a very authoritative way. Also some House seats flipping and the House becoming firmly in Democratic control. And, going into the 2019-2020 legislative season cycle, if you will, expectations were very high. And Cecil's going to talk a little bit about one of the big changes that came about in 2019 with the CLCPA and the implications, what it is going forward. But all thoughts were, between that legislation and some other really big bills that happened, toxic toy legislation, et cetera, there were very low expectations that there'd be much happening in 2020 by way of new ground to be broken, right? The idea and the general expectation was there was a big wave of environmental things done in 2019. There might not be much action in 2020, and then the big show will just be in the fall. But we were surprised that what ended up happening was a little bit different than that. So, sorry for a second. Here it is. So what ended up happening was that the state budget, which was adopted on or about the 1st of April, ended up having many environmental accomplishments that we had been hoping for, but didn't think were coming up at that time. There was a major reform in terms of renewable energy siting. The key here is that under the former, or I should say current, Article 10 power plant siting process, there had been a massive glut or backlog, if you will, of the siting of large-scale renewable projects, wind and solar in particular, that had not been able to break free, and it had been, been backing up to the point where relief was needed, especially since obviously we want to transition off fossil fuels as quickly as possible, given that wind and solar prices have really become plummeted, given that the number of green jobs that have been created over the last many years has just been escalating. But one of the big things that come out of the state budget was finally this reform. Added to that, a couple other major developments that were really notable here. It's a little bit smaller, but not unimportant. The liberation of the e-bikes and e-scooters, which I know in other parts of this state and within the city, there was looking for relief on that. There had been a lot of tension over the years for that, but that was a bill that was able to be resolved. Additional clean water funding in terms of the clean water infrastructure, in addition to the $2.5 billion that had been committed by the state back in 2017, in addition to the additional $2.5 billion that the governor had committed and the legislature have been allocating for. Even more funding, which is really terrific, now to the tune of $1 billion annually. A fully funded environmental protection fund, which may not be as big of a deal, but given that it is a chief economic engine and Governor Cuomo has really stabilized it, the fact that he keeps funding it at the full level, it's not scaled back, is really important. And of course the polystyrene ban as well. So many things came together, and this was a very big deal in terms of the environment. And we knew something big was happening when Governor Cuomo made his State of the State address, because typically the environment is mentioned somewhere in the middle, maybe sometimes toward the end, and maybe there's some vague kind of comments. This year, he really decided to lean into it. He started off his speech on the policy front going on about environmental issues, which is really noteworthy and really terrific. So there was a lot to show for that. But one thing that was really big here in the budget proposal was the Environmental Bond Act. This is really literally a once in a generation opportunity to make major investments for our environment. The last statewide Environmental Bond Act was in 1996. It was for $1.75 billion. That was the Clean Air Bond Act that Governor Pataki had introduced and the legislature had approved and the voters approved ultimately. But we haven't had a statewide bond act since. And so this is a pretty big deal. And the number is terrific. $3 billion is a pretty good number. But it's really encouraging, though, is the focus. And the focus here is, as you can see from this pie chart, the way that the different categories are set up, right? So this is a bond act that's really meant to focus on preparing, our state for climate change. The effects of climate change. The mitigation, making it more, and making our infrastructure more resilient. Dealing with floods, dealing with all sorts of great open space projects that we've been thinking about and been wanting, but now there's a funding proposal behind it. What the governor was able to do with this proposal is to really crystallize, I guess, his interest in infrastructure, which is legendary at this point. He loves building things, bridges and roads and airports and things like that. But marrying that with environmental protection, and this is this is really a marriage of that is timely and very important. The state of play here is that it's a proposal that we hope and anticipate will be approved by the voters. But there's an asterisk, and the asterisk is such that tucked into this bill, which we were aware of, is that the budget director of the state of New York will need to, and we believe it's by middle or early August, will need to make a final determination about whether or not this legislation, which is the vehicle for the Bond Act, is valid or not, specifically as it relates to the economy. When they were crafting this budget, they wanted to make sure that there was an Environmental Bond Act on track for a voter approval for the fall. But they did put it in a safety valve, because you got to remember this was done end of March, right at the beginning of April. They put it in a safety valve to make sure that if for some reason there were very dire economic reasons and indicators that the state budget director felt that the state could not withstand this additional kind of borrowing, that the state budget director would have the power to, with the governor's obviously permission, to nullify this. And so that is an asterisk. That's something we need to always be aware of, and the environmental community is doing everything that it needs to do in terms of preparing for it, in terms of gauging public opinion and public education. But there's a slight chance that in an unusual and extraordinary way, the Bond Act might not happen. But we'll have to see how that plays out. But in the meantime, this is a good way to educate people about the possibility, and hopefully that safety valve will not have to be turned off, and we'll be able to have the ability to go to the voters and encourage them to vote yes. So I'm sure there'll be some questions about that later, but let me move on to the political side of things that I want to discuss with you all. And now a word from our sponsors. These are the groups, by the way, that are part of the ongoing conversation, the steering committee, if you will, of this Bond Act, just to make sure that we are poised, if we get the green light, no pun intended, to go to the voters and ask for their permission. Shifting over, since effectively the legislative season ended after the budget was put into place, in terms of open, an open agenda. What I mean by that is the legislature has since returned, because they've had to put in some very important piece of legislation regarding COVID. They've had to put some important piece of legislation regarding racial injustice and police reforms. They've also needed to do some administrative dealings related to taxes that were lapsing. But beyond that, there has not been an open agenda since the 1st of April. What's basically happened is that the conversation's now shifted toward what's going to happen in the upcoming elections. So this is a map here of, for anyone's wondering, the different colors. This happens to be the 2016 county by county coloring in terms of Trump versus Clinton, blue being for Clinton, red being for Trump. And the darker the color, the more intense it is for the respective candidates. This is just a snapshot in time of where the voter mood was at. I think it's fair to say, based on a lot of the national polling, that there's been shifts, which we'll discuss a little bit. But in terms of our state map here, we've got 27 congressional seats, 63 Senate seats, and 150 Assembly seats that are up in this year. So I just want to quickly walk you through what the statewide version looks like here in terms of competitive races, and then zoom in a little bit on New York City, because there's a lot of activity in this city. Let's see. Can I get this to advance? Okay, sorry about that. All right, so around the state, in terms of the general election, there are about 8 competitive seats. As you can see, they're sprinkled around the state. You have several on Long Island. You have a couple in the, one in the Hudson Valley, and they're pretty much spread around. Some of these seats are not new in terms of their competitiveness. What's interesting is, there are a couple open seats in District 2 on Long Island, in District 27 up in Western New York, although that seat will be filled because there's a special election currently for that with the prior Congress member taking up another career in jail. But a lot of these races that we're looking at, the 1st District, the 19th District, 21st District, 22nd, 24th, these were competitive last time. They're competitive again. That's why you see their purple stars here. These are really those purple districts. But you know, the expectation is that the state delegation, you know, will remain strongly blue. The big question is really, will there be a pickup either in New York 27 or New York 21, which those seats are currently held by Republicans, or New York 1 or New York 24. What we look at is which races are competitive through the Cook Political Report, which is a nonpartisan DC-based prognosticator. I think at this point, the only race which is really a toss-up is District 22, Brindisi. A lot of these other races are sort of a second or third tier, not even on the map yet. But as we get closer to November, we do expect maybe a few more races to come into focus. Around the state, the big headline here are the open seats within the state Senate. This is a big deal. As I mentioned, in 2018, there was that blue wave of, you know, Democrats picking up 8 seats effectively and taking a huge majority, and it has really just led to a large exodus of Republican state senators who are voting with their feet and leaving. So 12 open seats is just, it's an incredibly large number. You might have 1 or 2 or 3 in any given cycle, but to have 12 out of a body of 63 is pretty huge. So, you know, there is every expectation that, you know, the Democrats will be picking up a few seats here, just given what's happening nationally, but also the fact that a lot of these districts have enjoyed a Democratic majority, but there's been a Republican holding that seat for a while, and when those seats open up, Democrats do have a much better shot, and they tend to pick up seats. So, for instance, you know, District 55 or 56, which is in the Rochester area, that's one. Those are 2 seats that have had Democratic enrollment advantages for years now, which now that the seat is open, would really benefit the Democrats there. So this is a big deal. So the fact that you're going to have so many senators who are departing won't change the overall makeup of the majority. It'll just add to, you know, new energy, and hopefully more pro-environment, you know, supporters from these areas. Moving on to the next slide here. Sorry. In New York City, just to kind of go into New York City now, I didn't have a statewide assembly general election map up because there's going to be very little turnover in terms of seats flipping. In the assembly, there's about 108 or 9 Democrats to, you know, 42 Republicans. It is overwhelmingly, you know, Democratic. So there's no expectation that there's going to be any change in leadership there. A lot of the actions in the primaries, which I'm going to get to. But moving over to the New York City's focus here, this is another huge number. There are 11 congressional primaries. As you can see, all the stars here. There are very few places very few districts where there is not a primary. And this is a big deal. You know, it's like the AOC effect in many respects, right? Where you have a lot of candidates that she's supporting, people coming out of the DSA, or just average, you know, New Yorkers who are fed up with the establishment. You just have a lot of energy in New York City congressional primaries, more than has been seen in a very long time. One of the seats we talked about, or we will talk about, I'm sure, in detail, is up in the Bronx. It's an open seat. And, you know, that is just a fascinating cross-section of really talented candidates, including one candidate who everyone is against in that race. We can talk about that in detail later. But just the big picture here is that there's just a lot of energy. So unusual, but it just kind of speaks to the time that we were in. This was a very similar energy that was seen 2 years ago in the New York State Senate races. But what's interesting is that even though there are 10 primaries, which isn't a lot, it's not the majority at all. There are far fewer Senate primaries this year, and that's because of the effectiveness of the anti-IDC candidates that came up 2 years ago, and because of that, the energy level has been focused in different directions, mostly Congress. Although interestingly enough, you do have at least you have one former IDC member who is vacating his seat to run for Congress in Westchester. You have another one who was beat 2 years ago, who's running for an assembly seat. But the action overall in the state Senate, there's not as much unrest as there was 2 years ago. There's still people who are waiting in the wings to challenge the status quo, members, and some of them who've been there for a while, but not as bad as it was 2 years ago. But when you flip to the assembly, this is really also fascinating as well. You have, as I mentioned, that energy from 2 years ago in the state Senate going in different directions, some running for Congress and a whole bunch of people running for assembly. And this is something we have not seen also in a very, very long time. This is going to be the Speaker, Carl Heastie's greatest challenge, to be defending his members. There are very few open seats here. There are just a few, about 3 or 4, but you have a lot of long time and newer members who who've been loyal to Speaker Heastie, that are counting on his support. His support is through the Democratic Assembly Campaign Committee. But it is unusual. So, the purpose of these maps is to show that, no matter where you live in New York City, chances are you've got a primary brewing in your backyard. And there are some really fascinating races, and we can, during Q&A or through the chat, we can, if you have questions about any particular race, I can do my best to tell you what I know. But this has been definitely something that's noteworthy here. One great resource I want to recommend to everyone is the campaign finance board. This is the entity that runs all the match program for all candidates that are running in the city of New York for city races. But they do a terrific job, even though they don't do the funding for the state races. They do a terrific job in terms of candidate education. They have this amazing voters guide. So anyway, I just encourage people to check out Campaign Finance Board, New York City Campaign Finance Board. The website is listed there. And it's a good resource. They'll tell you more information about how to find your polling place, how to request an absentee ballot, which is also very useful as well. So I just wanted to share that with folks. And that's where I'm going to stop for now. I know we're going to have an opportunity after Cecil talks to maybe get into some more detail. But I just wanted people to know that whether we want to talk about what's been happening on state policy recently or what we are hoping for in the future, I can certainly talk about that when we get to Q&A. Or if we want to drill down onto some of these particular races on the Assembly, Senate, or Congress, happy to talk about that as well. But if people want to get in touch with me, this is my information here. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I guess hand it off to Evan, who's going to hand it off to Cecil. Is that what we're doing? Or do I just hand it off to Cecil?
Yeah, but Harris was going to. Harris,
Harris.
There you are.
Hello, everyone. I just want to remind everyone that they can be typing their questions in the chat. And at the end for our Q&A, there's a raise your hand function. So we can do that as well if you want to verbally ask the question. But with that said, yeah, I'm going to give it off to Cecil to continue.
Can we hear Cecil?
Seems maybe he muted himself in a different way, Cecil, if you could check your...
Can you hear me now?
There you go.
Yeah, that's called a double muting trick to make absolutely sure that no sound gets through. I will start all over again. I want to thank Evan for pulling us all together and for inviting me back to this conversation again. I really appreciate it. I want to thank Josh for walking us through the political thicket that is New York City and New York State coming up in the upcoming elections. Josh is one of those fonts of information with regards to the political landscape, and I really appreciated him walking us through all of that. I'm going to just share with you some of my knowledge about the Green New Deal. I'm going to try to lay it out in as simple a way as possible. I'm also going to spend a little bit of time talking about the Climate Leadership Community Protection Act, something that my organization worked a lot on. And then I'll round out by talking about Local Law 97, which is the city's Climate Mobilization Act. Again, another thing that my organization worked on. And so I really want to be able to share those things with you, and I'll try to walk through them in a way that's fairly straightforward and simple. So we're going to start with the Green New Deal. Wanted to provide for the audience a basic understanding of the Green New Deal. The Green New Deal, for those of you unfamiliar with it, I'm sure everybody has heard it. Some people have heard it, but don't really know what it is really all about. The first thing I think I want people to understand about the Green New Deal is that it was a resolution, a congressional resolution that was introduced in February of 2019, spearheaded by the efforts of Congresswoman Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Edward Markey in the Senate, and is only 14 pages in length. So I think people should take stock of that. And what it does, as most resolutions do, is that they try to signal or lay out broad frameworks or big, bold ideas that Congress wants to share with the nation. The other most significant thing about a congressional resolution, or most resolutions in legislative bodies, is that they are non-binding. And so people may have heard, well, oh, there was a resolution introduced about the Green New Deal, and they may think, well, that means that, oh, this is set in stone, and it is now carved in the corner of one of the foundational stones of the United States Congress. No, it is really just advisory in some respects. And even more than that, the Green New Deal, I can't emphasize enough, is a broad framework that does not have a whole lot of specifics. So it is a framework that is intended to really lay out a series of goals that will help the United States fight the climate crisis, but it'll also help really overhaul the U.S. economy. It is a framework or a program that aims to transform the U.S. economy by tackling some big challenges that we have in our society. So income inequality is one of them. Injustice, and very directly there are some pieces that you'll read about the Green New Deal that basically talk about tackling racism in the United States. And then the threats to climate change. It's bold and ambitious, and it sets targets for us that are quite high as an economy, but people believe are absolutely necessary to sort of be that guiding star, that North Star, that moonshot, if you will, to really transform our economic reality from what it is right now, primarily based on a fossil fuel infrastructure, to an infrastructure that is green, renewable, and clean. And I'll come back to those terms in a second so that we can just unpack them a little bit. If you drill down a little bit and you read some of the language in the Green New Deal, again, it's only 14 pages, you'll see that it's designed to take an older economy that has been, as I said, based on fossil fuel, driven by the fossil fuel energy production, into a green and sustainable economy that is both environmentally sound, economically viable, socially responsible, and that we're going to do that in a way that transitions us to a zero carbon economy that will have as some of its fundamental pillars investment in green businesses by providing grants, low interest loans to grow green businesses and green economic opportunities. It will try to support cooperatives as possible, with a real focus on small, locally based companies. That's the aspiration. It'll also work to make sure that we are moving towards 100% clean energy by 2030. It'll prioritize research in green efforts and initiatives. It'll redirect some of the existing research funds that are in the economy already from fossil fuels and what are generally referred to as other gray and dead-end industries towards research in wind, solar, geothermal. It'll provide green jobs by enacting a full employment program, which will, in their hope, provide directly 16 million jobs in sustainable energy and energy efficiency. If you think about this, it's, as I said, quite ambitious, but there are many more pieces to it that are part of the Green New Deal that often don't get as much cover as some of the things that I just discussed. And I just wanted to share some of those with you. The idea is that they are also going to have a number of socioeconomic policies, things like a job with a family-sustaining wage, family and medical leave, vacations, retirement security, high-quality education, including higher education and trade schools, high-quality health care, safe, affordable, and adequate housing, an economic environment that preferences really opportunities more for small businesses and tries to break up larger corporate monopolies, and intends to try to provide economic security for all who are unable or unwilling to work. So there are, in the Green New Deal, some of the many core tenets. Some of those that I just discussed don't get as much play, but they're all sort of tied together in this broader framework to achieve some of the bigger pillars of the vision that I talked about earlier. There's a lot of controversy about the Green New Deal, and one of the controversies that I tend to focus on and my organization tries to work on is really about how is this all going to happen, right? I won't get into the economics. You know, there are some people who, you know, say, well, we can't afford this and we can't da-da-da-da. And quite frankly, from my perspective, that's all nonsense. It's, my grandmother would probably say it's like foolishness with a capital F or something. And I say that truly because when we economically and politically, when we politically want to do something, it gets done, right? When we politically don't want to do something, we don't have the political will to do something, it doesn't get done. And no greater case than that for me in person as a Black man in America, this question of dealing politically with racism, right? We have not had the political will to do that. And we see, you know, how long that has languished and what it has brought us to in this particular moment. But we won't go deep on that at this particular moment. But I like to focus on the sort of like, what are the real nuts and bolts to make it happen? And when you start to drill down on some of these platforms, let's just take things like worker training and trade schools and those kinds of things, you can begin to really delve deep into the existing sort of policy architecture at the federal level, where there are significant resources put towards worker training programs that help the underemployed, the unemployed, worker training programs that in many ways target particular communities like African-American communities, Latinx communities, et cetera. And really, I think the pathway to making the Green New Deal possible is not as daunting as some might have you believe. It's really about critically looking at existing policy pipelines and figuring out where we might need to create greater investment for some of the things to happen. So you know, for example, I'll take another example, the whole focus on local small businesses, local economies, rather than the bigger corporate structures. There's a whole small business infrastructure that comes out of the federal government, and I would preface that, I would put forth the premise that it's important for us to look into those places to give life to the Green New Deal. So there are arguments about how much it might cost. I leave those alone because, you know, it's about our future, and I figure that, you know, at some point we're either going to have to wake up and pay the price, or we will pay the price in another way. So I don't give much credence to it's too costly, it's too this, it's too that. But I do focus a lot on how are we actually going to operationalize the Green New Deal? And I think that you're seeing more of that happening now. There are lots of folks working on that. I know my organization is working on especially the worker training aspects of it, and working with people like Representative AOC and others in Congress around that. I know that there are others who are working on other elements of it. You see that Representative Ilhan Omar and Representative Ayanna Pressley from Minnesota and Massachusetts, respectively, have worked on a Green New Deal for affordable housing, another vehicle that will sort of put more of the nuts and bolts of how to operationalize these things to move forward. So that's the broad vision of the Green New Deal, 14 pages, a resolution that was introduced in Congress in 2019, non-binding, so there's nothing that says Congress must and shall do these things. It's got a lot of very big targets in it, and it is not, it's at this moment a fairly open vessel for many of us to come in and help with the idea of how we actually operationalize it, but we can get into more of that as we take questions moving forward. So next, I'm going to hop into the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. I will share with you that the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act started out as the Community Protection and Climate Leadership Act, and there's a story behind that. And it started out really with the advocacy of the environmental justice communities across the state, really working to share with our mainstream green enviros the idea that some of the policies that were being pursued at the state level in terms of sustainability and climate were being done in many instances without a holistic vision of how do we make sure that some of our most vulnerable communities, environmental justice communities, communities with either high heat vulnerability or high rates of asthma from the levels of air pollution in their neighborhoods, how do we protect those communities as we go, right? The idea being that our focus on climate cannot only be about how many tons of carbon do we extract from the air, but that we really also need to think about that in tandem with how are we reducing some of the co-pollutants like diesel, like nitrogen oxide, that are in many instances prematurely cutting short the lives of many of our fellow citizens in New York purely because of the zip codes in which they live. And so the mainstream enviros worked with environmental justice organizations to really craft a better platform from our perspective, one that really says, we're going to pursue our climate goals and targets. We're going to reduce CO2 emissions in New York State dramatically, but we're going to do so in a way that is fully cognizant of a broader, more holistic picture of how do we protect communities that are already on the front lines of the climate crisis and being harmed. And so to that end, we hammered out a series of provisions that ultimately got shaped, molded, moved around a little bit, negotiated to what ultimately became the Climate Leadership Community Protection Act, which the governor's people, by the way, decided that was the name they wanted to go with. Our governor has a penchant for making sure that, he's got his stamp on things. You heard Josh talking about the penchant he has for building things. His penchants run wide and deep, and building things is not all that's there. But nonetheless, we successfully were able to get the Climate Leadership Community Protection Act signed into law. The governor did sign it, and it is, in many respects, one of the groundbreaking national models of how we can both pursue the goals of protecting vulnerable communities while at the same time aggressively getting to net zero greenhouse gas emissions. So let me just say a few things about the CLCPA and go through that with you. The mandate in the CLCPA is that New York is going to reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions, and that's all sectors of our economy. People may be familiar with the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which has been in operation in New York State and several other Northeast states for some decades now. But this goes beyond just, and the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative covers just electricity, but this goes beyond that and covers all sectors of the economy and fuels that are imported even from other states. The mandate is that we will 40% of our emissions reductions in absolute terms from 1990 levels by 2030. So that's our first benchmark. And then 85% of emissions will be reduced by 2050. And that's the ultimate goal that we want to get to. The ability for us to get to those net zero emissions, CLCPA sets up pathways for us to deal with emissions beyond 85% to either be directly reduced or offset through projects that remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. Though all of those offsets must be verifiable and permanent, which is critically important because we've often seen where some of these programs will take offsets and they could disappear. The programs that generate the offsets could then just sort of fall apart, disappear. You don't know that they're doing anything. That's been one of the troublesome scams about the types of offset programs that have sprung up globally. And the offset program must be designed in a manner that it does not disproportionately harm disadvantaged communities and achieve the greatest extent practicable of offsetting emissions as we move forward. And they must be located within 25 miles of the actual source that they're portending to offset. So there you have really what we call tightening the noose around these offsets. So offset programs sometimes would have been trying to offset emissions in the South Bronx or Upper Manhattan in Harlem, for example, and they would have been projects in, the Ecuadorian tropical forest somewhere or something like that. And we were like, no, that is not what we're talking about. So really tightening the nexus between where the source of pollution is and the offset programs themselves. I'll just quickly run through that in some of the sectors that we're extracting emissions from. There are specific targets that are spelled out in the CLCPA. So for example, 70% of the state's electricity must come from renewable energy by 2030, and 100% of the state's electricity supply must come from emissions-free sources by 2040. 9,000 megawatts of offshore wind must be installed to serve New Yorkers by 2035. There are some great projects that are right off the New York City coast line and off Long Island coastline and the Rockaways, et cetera, that will be springing up in the not too distant future. Really exciting opportunities there to help us as we propel ourselves toward this 9,000 megawatt offshore target of offshore wind. And 6,000 megawatts of solar energy must be installed to serve New Yorkers by 2025. And a statewide goal on reducing energy consumption by 185 trillion BTUs, or British thermal units, from the state's 2025 forecast through energy efficiency improvements, something that we ACT is really eager to see happen, particularly in environmental justice communities, to help reduce the burden of the expense of electricity generation in our communities. And then 3,000 megawatts of energy storage capacity needs to be installed to serve New Yorkers. All of this is going to be scoped out and built up by a Climate Action Council. It will be a 22-member body made up of heads of different state agencies, as well as experts appointed by the governor, the Speaker of the Assembly, and the Majority Leader of the Senate. The Climate Action Council has started to meet already. They've had their first meeting and they're trying to organize their second meeting right now. They will be required to create a scoping plan that will really set out a series of recommendations for how we're actually going to get on the path to reducing emissions in more granular detail for specific sectors across the economy. And that is something that we're hoping will get started. There'll be a number of subcommittees that help that council do its work. And so the council is really beginning to look at who might be populating those committees at this moment. And then I will say that one of the biggest and most satisfying pieces of this bill for those of us in the environmental justice community is that there's a real clear mandate here that, that the work of getting to these emissions reductions will not harm disadvantaged communities. And it goes further than just saying it won't harm, but the law actually includes several environmental justice provisions setting a target for disadvantaged communities to receive 40% of the overall benefits from the state's climate programs, and at a minimum, disadvantaged communities must receive no less than 35% of those benefits. The Climate Leadership Community Protection Act creates a climate justice working group, which will advise the Climate Action Council and establish final criteria for identifying disadvantaged communities based on considerations related to public health, environmental hazards, and socioeconomic factors. So overall, this is one of the most ambitious, if not the most ambitious, I would say, climate legislation in the entire nation, and I look forward to talking to you a little bit more about that. I will wind up just sharing a little bit with you about Local Law 97, which is the Climate Mobilization Act here in the New York City area. The Climate Mobilization Act is a piece of legislation that was passed by the City Council and signed into law by the mayor. Many organizations, both LCP as well as others, and I should have referenced LCP as supporting and working on the Climate Leadership Community Protection Act as well. But at the local level in the New York City Council, many of us worked on getting this law passed as well. And this was another very hard-fought victory for several environmental justice organizations as well, my own included. This law sets carbon emissions caps for energy use in New York City's largest buildings or large buildings starting in 2024. For those of you who don't know, buildings contribute 32 or 33 or so % of the emissions of carbon in the city. And they are one of the big targets that we need to go after if the city is to really get its own sort of carbon emissions profile under control. The highlights of the Local Law 97 or the Climate Mobilization Act includes that it targets buildings that are greater than 25,000 square feet, although just recently there was a bill introduced by Council Member Costa Constantinidis, who chairs the Environmental Protection Committee, to lower that threshold in terms of square feet that the bill would target, but that hasn't passed into law just yet. Just a quick note for you to be aware of that. It sets increasingly stringent limits on carbon emissions per square foot in 2024, and then again in 2030. It is intended to try to create renewable energy credits and or emissions offsets. It allows some affordable housing to choose low-cost energy-saving measures instead of emissions limits. This was very important to those of us from the environmental justice movement really getting behind this bill because, again, one of the things that some of our brothers and sisters in the mainstream green environmental movement do is that they often sort of focus myopically on how can I reduce carbon emissions. And what we in the environmental justice movement said, well, you can't do this legislation if it's going to turn around and allow landlords to just suddenly be jacking up the cost of rent for people who are already struggling in New York City. And so this was a pretty important provision for us to have that kind of flexibility for affordable housing to be able to both take advantage of getting to these emissions reduction measures, but also making sure that, you know, that they did it in a way that was most affordable and most economical for them to do it as well. New office building and energy emissions performance, a new office of building performance and energy emissions at the Department of Buildings to help us really track and look at what's going on here. There's a strong advisory board that's set up through the law itself. My organization is occupying one of the seats on that advisory board currently. It does set up a carbon trading study and implementation plan. This is one that is a little bit of a lump of coal for those of us in the environmental justice movement who are not really fond of carbon trading. But it is a mechanism in the law for that study to move forward, and that is ongoing at the moment. And then there are penalties for non-compliance, and variances for financial hardship. So both a little bit of a stick, but also some carrots as well to make people go over there. The idea for this law is that it will help really cover a large swath of both the residential building sector and the city's commercial buildings as well. And that we will get to these emissions reduction of 40% by 2030 from a 2005 baseline so that we're making real change to that emissions profile for the city. And then, you know, one of the things that I think is important is that there's going to be, I think, a lot of assistance built in through the Department of Buildings to really help building owners. And I think that, like the clean fuel standard that we put in several years ago in the city, there will be hopefully resources to help the nonprofit environmental sector really support buildings in this transition, especially those in affordable housing, in the affordable housing sector and in low-income neighborhoods across the city. So with that, I'm 2 minutes over the extra time that I wanted to take, and so I'll stop there and just say that this is also a fairly aggressive and groundbreaking piece of legislation that the city signed into law, and that we're all looking forward to sort of helping work to make successful. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Cecil. Okay, so before we actually get to the Q&A, we are going to do just one more poll, and then we can incorporate that into our discussion. So we'll just take about a minute here and just answer the poll.
Yep, and it's really about just gauging where folks are and what they know about things, and but don't see it as a test. You know, facilitate some of the Q&A.
There's a little typo there. When does early voting start in the New York State primaries? Which and there is no early voting in New York State. June 13th or June 23rd. Interesting. Josh, Cecil, do you want to handle that? So we have 50% of people saying there is no early voting in New York State, and we have 50% saying June 23rd.
That's early results. So I'd say give folks some more time to
we'll give them a few more minutes. There's a timer on the poll.
There are not very many. I just see how many voted. A lot of people didn't vote. Maybe that's because they don't know. Anyway, let's just jump in.
Yeah. All right, they're coming in now.
Yeah.
And if unclear, say take your best guess. We'll give folks, what, like 30 more seconds maybe?
Yes.
Okay. So that seems about half the people voted. Now I'll give it. Keep coming in. Okay. All right, it was 2 minutes for the poll. So sharing the results now. Cecil, can you see the results on your page?
Yes, I can. I see. Well, I see red and blue, and I see percentages. So, do you want me to hit stop and share results? Is that what you want me to do?
I think it is stop here. Well, if
answer the. I mean, when? So, is there early voting in New York State? And if so, when is the deadline?
Josh, do you want to go? I know there's early voting in New York State.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so June 23rd, that's the primary day. Okay, so June 23rd is primary day. Early voting starts 10 days prior to the primary day, although not not the day before. So that Monday before, there's not or any more early voting. And those are spread around at sites that are not necessarily your regular polling site. So it could be at a community center, it could be at a place that is not a normal polling site, but for reasons that are beyond me, are designated as being a good place to catch people.
And now with the ballots, right? If you request a ballot due to COVID-19, you can actually, those ballots can be postmarked right up until the actual date of June 23rd. Is that correct? Right, Josh?
Yeah, that's right. You have until, so you have until this a week before to submit the application. Right. And everyone should have gotten one by mail, or you could have gone online earlier. So the City Board of Elections required one by email. But you have until the 16th to request application. You have until June 23rd to have that ballot postmarked in order for it to be counted after the fact. So if you send in a ballot and it's postmarked the 24th of June or later, no dice. It's got to
no
be
good.
No dice. You got to be postmarked in by the 23rd.
Yeah.
So the key takeaway is that we do have early voting, and as of, I don't know, 3 days from now, you can get in your early voting ballot. And it's the first time we've ever had that.
Actually, the second time. We did
We
have
did
it last
second.
year. We had it
Yeah,
last
we
year.
You did?
Yeah. Well, New York City,
Yeah.
there, it was a quiet year election-wise, right? There weren't any citywide races or city council races or borough president races. I mean, there were DA races, but it was not a big. But they did have it last year.
You're right. I remember that. Okay. So next question is about the Environmental Bond Act. I guess you want to handle that one, Josh?
Yeah, the first answer and the fourth answer, those are correct. Open space and land conservation and disaster resilient design. Organic waste collection, recycling, no. Drinking water supply protections, if I were to use my power of connecting the dots, I mean, one could say that certain types of land preservation does aid drinking water supply protection, but it's not an express, it will be a subsidiary benefit, but it's not an express purpose of the Bond Act. The Bond Act is the express purpose is really for mitigating the effects of climate change, make sure the infrastructure is resilient, and the open space purchases and the land conservations are really meant to front load and promote those types of activities.
But Josh, you would say that one of the things related to water in our city is the sewage treatment plants have their section under the Bond Act as well, right?
That's infrastructure, absolutely, infrastructure. Yeah. Yep.
And the last one.
And then the last?
Oh, I didn't even see the last one. Let me scroll down here. Oh yeah.
So
you take that one, Evan.
No, I'm just a troublemaker. I just put that in there because I really want to make, I wanted to have a question about jobs that so often forget that the environment and creation of job creation are completely consistent. And the answer is there are many more, I can get the actual numbers, but there are more jobs in energy efficiency than renewables. I can pull up the answer in a minute, but I just put that in there because I really wanted to underscore that green jobs are, better.
And I'll just jump in there and back you up on that, Evan, and say that's one of the reasons that my organization, We Act, has introduced in the state legislature something called the Energy Efficiency, Equity, and Jobs Act, a bill that has in the Senate, its sponsor is Kevin Parker, and the number is S8052. And in the Assembly, the sponsor is Assemblywoman Pam Hunter. The reason for that is we want to make sure that as we think about energy efficiency, which is one of the categories that's here, is that we really begin to zero in and target on communities that have some of the highest energy burden in our state. And when we talk about energy burden, we're really talking about how much of people's income are they using to pay for their energy costs, right? And the Energy Efficiency, Equity, and Jobs Act would require that more of our dollars be spent on energy efficiency in those most burdened communities, but it be done in a way that also sets aside jobs for those communities to be engaged in the process of making homes more energy efficient. It would also require that we track things like non-energy benefits flowing from these kinds of energy efficiency investments. So what do we mean by non-energy benefits? Things like, you know, what are the jobs that are created? What are the health benefits that may come? So that we begin to get a broader constituency of people who are supportive of the energy efficiency investments because they recognize these other kinds of benefits as well. So much in support of this question being there, and thank you for slipping that one in.
Do we have other questions, Harris?
So far we have one from Yanis, so I'll read off that one right now. It's for Cecil. New York State generates trillions in rental incomes, but they're only getting minimally taxed. Rents are the primary driver of inequality and high cost of living for working people. What does the Green New Deal plan to do with rental incomes? Will it allow them to increase while the rent collectors privately collect publicly funded infrastructure real estate values?
Yeah, I think I saw that question in the, now just as I was, sorry. I think I saw that question in the chat. Thank you for pulling that one up, Harris. The Green New Deal, again, as I can't emphasize this enough, does not have a whole lot of specifics in it at all. And so to say that the Green New Deal has some prescribed path for, you know, either taxing rent or you know, some other legislative mechanism or policy mechanism for dealing with the issue of rent would be to mislead the audience. What it does, however, is really set out a vision for safe, affordable housing, and say that in the way that this begins to unfold or begins to be unpacked, that we have to make sure that housing is affordable for people moving forward, and that it is, you know, climate resilient and safe and so forth. The closest the Green New Deal comes to beginning to really sketch out something around affordable housing is the bill that has just started its journey, if you will, around affordable housing that's been introduced by Representative Ayanna Pressley and of Massachusetts and Representative Ilhan Omar, called the Green New Deal for Affordable Housing. I have to admit that I don't know, I haven't gotten around to reading all the details about that, so I really can't say what exactly that does. But I can tell you for sure that there isn't a prescribed path for taxing the rent to help with any issue around affordable housing or plans for that in the Green New Deal. Hope that is that's as helpful as I can be on that front.
Thank you. So I just want to remind everyone, type in their questions in the chat. Also, if you want to ask the question, you can do that raise your hand function. I'm not seeing any other questions, but Yanis does have another question, so I guess we'll just give a go at that. Given the beneficial environmental effect of the lockdowns, should we continue in this direction? Have the lockdowns helped achieve the 2030 emissions goals, and by how much?
So I'll start, I can start and just say that There have been significant emissions reductions from the very significant elimination, really, of vehicular traffic. Primarily, lots of cars and the reduction of the buses on the street. Cargo truck movement, such as they are in the city, has continued pretty much, and you're seeing, as we've gotten closer to these reopened days, an increase in vehicular traffic. There was a pretty significant jump from April to May, and I suspect that when all is said and done, we will obviously see more of a jump from May to June. That said, we have experienced very significant benefits of decreased pollutants in the air in New York City widely. And that has obviously been of significant benefit, particularly for those communities that have been hardest hit, particularly with emissions. So think, for example, South Bronx, think Upper Manhattan, think parts of Brooklyn like, the Flatbush area, et cetera. So some of our communities have always traditionally been hardest hit, but they've also now experienced, obviously, some of the most devastating statistics regarding the COVID-19 crisis. And those emissions reductions have played a role in providing at least some little bit of help for those communities where both the confluence of both the respiratory nature of COVID-19 has attacked communities that have already had underlying conditions with respiratory illnesses and alarmingly high rates. But having this reduction in air pollution, I think obviously may have contributed to some little bit of relief in what is a very scary pandemic that's impacting communities of color, particularly African-American communities, even more virulently, unfortunately, than some of our other brothers and sisters in the city. This is not sustainable, however. If we go back to the way in which we have, even though people talk about a new normal, this particular pattern of emissions reductions is not sustainable because it has been forced in a certain way. And unless we redesign how we are going to move around the city, how we use our streets, unless we take this opportunity to really imagine boldly new visions for how we're going to move goods, people, and services in the city, we are going to find ourselves, sadly, probably reverting back to reverting back to where we were, or possibly even worse, because some people may opt not to get on to mass transit as a way of transporting themselves, despite some of the gains that are there. It's a scary thing. But I'll stop there and let Josh.
Yeah.
See if he has any comments.
It's a really interesting question because it's unfolding now in real time, right? So in New York City, at least, the relaxation of New York laws is taking effect, right? This is the first week, for phase one, phase two to follow, possibly several weeks from now, et cetera, et cetera. And so there are a lot of interesting questions. First of all, in terms of people leaving their homes, first of all, do they have a job to go back to, right? Will their business have closed, and will they then be leaving their home to go going back to work? There may not be a work to go back to. Even for the people who do have a job that are still, have a place of employment, how soon will they be going back? It's not my sense that, obviously under the New York pause, even when these phases are put in, there are still caps. So it's not like everyone goes back on day one. It gets phased in. But will there be workforces that just decide, what, we're not going to have as many of our people commute to the office anymore. That's the old model. The new model is remote working. And so, there might be some, again, short to midterm emissions offsets there. The MTA, talks about how it had its ridership down, by 90%, and how, are they going to, and how are people going to come back, or are they going to come back? And what is the MTA going to do about maybe inducing people to get back? I mean, riding a bus now is effectively free. I don't know if people know that. but it is effectively free to ride a bus, because the way that they're protecting the driver is that you have back door boarding only, and you have a big plastic sheet so that the driver is protected. But that's interesting. You know, it is effectively free to ride the bus. Will that continue for the foreseeable future to induce more people to come back to transit? Will the city do things that, and you've been reading about it more, you know, put in those dedicated bus lanes, that's part of it, but really double down, triple down on bike lanes, because you see a lot more people biking. Will they really engender that lifestyle in terms of getting around as opposed to taking transit of any kind? Because that's a great way to get around this city, but it has to be safer. So it's going to be really interesting to see how this unfolds. I don't think anyone wants or expects the paradigm to go back to the way it was in terms of the tension between people driving versus people taking transit versus people, you know, versus bicycle people and pedestrians that have very little rights or safety. I think it's all going to be different and new, and I think there could be a benefit, a net positive benefit for climate. It's just, you know, the MTA and the city really need to make that construct such that it's pushing people toward carbon friendly or carbon free modes of transit.
Those are some great points. It's looking pretty bleak right now in terms of really ramping up bicycling infrastructure and those bus lanes. But the city is making progress slowly. And kind of going off of that, I don't see any other questions right now, but I have a question.
I have a question. Oh, you have a question? You go.
I have a question. I recently saw an interview with the mayor, and he was asked about congestion pricing. And I think he said that they were holding off on doing that because they wanted to work on saving money for like more tangible projects. But isn't the money from congestion pricing going to finance those projects? And do you know what the status is of congestion?
The short answer is, unfortunately, these days, you know, what the mayor says, you have to double, triple check. Congestion pricing is being held up in large part because of federal approvals. There still needs to be some significant federal approvals to be given, because, you know, the roadways are a mix between state and local control, but some of them are on the federal side. And ultimately, though, it's the governor who's driving, you know, the congestion pricing train. But that is going to be a tool, to Cecil's point earlier. You know, if people really decide, you know what, I'm just going to start driving in, and you see the bad congestion coming back, that is a policy tool in the future that was put in, you know, to place last year, which could be an equalizer, and it also could fund transit. But to answer your question, there are other things holding it up. It's not always as the mayor says.
So I have a whole lot of questions, but we only have 6 minutes, so I'm not going to get to ask them all. But I wanted if Josh can run through the underbelly. I love knowing about the underbelly of these elections. The Meng seat, Rose seat, Serrano seat, and possibly the Lowy seat. And then I have like so many questions for Cecil, but on 97 and CLCPA, but I don't think we can get to it.
I'll choose one of those, and that'll be the District 15 in the Bronx's Serrano seat. You know, it's just a very interesting race, because there's no doubt that, you know, whoever wins the Democratic primary will be the member of Congress there. What's super interesting about this race is that you have a field of very accomplished, you know, progressive types of all sorts and backgrounds and things like that, professional, you know, or volunteer based, etc., all running against Ruben Diaz Sr., or he dropped the senior now. It's just Ruben Diaz, who has a very conservative voting record. You know, on choice, he's been very friendly with Republicans. He hasn't said whether or not he's going to support, you know, Biden versus Trump. I mean, it's just a fascinating race, because in a race with, you know, 6 or 7 people running, you don't need a lot of votes to win. And if you have the progressive base all kind of splitting it up, it does open up a possibility for Ruben Diaz Sr., who's been in the state Senate. He's currently in the state in the city council. and he's a pastor who has a base, who has a following, to possibly win. So that's really the most interesting of a lot of these races. Will a Trump supporting, otherwise conservative Democrat get elected in this race? And if that were to happen, how would that really upset or even be a thorn in the side of the overall Democratic agenda, as it at least being unified within the city of New York, which you don't have a lot of unity in the city of New York among Democrats to begin with, but he would really be a big distraction. So that's an interesting one, I think.
I agree. That is a very interesting one.
Since all politics is local, do either of you want to take a stab and in this question, how do you think that some of the local elections reflect the schism in the Democratic Party between the progressives and the more traditional conservative Democrats? With the Meng seat, who's being primaried, and even in the Serrano elections, there are a lot of splits. Do you think that's something worth thinking about a little bit? Maybe not.
No, I would just say, look, in some of these races, the more candidates that there are to take on an incumbent who's the establishment, and I'll put it more like binary, establishment versus non-establishment, the more energy there is and the more candidates you have, the harder it is to unseat an establishment person. So if you have a 2-person or 3-person race, the odds are higher. But part of the issue is going to have to be what the establishment person is doing. And I mean, who had a terrible week as an establishment person? Elliot Engel. I mean, he and those are the kinds of things you can't map out 3 or 6 or 8 weeks before an election. But if you say something very, very foolish, very, very close to an election, those are the kinds of unforced errors that can really turn. And that is not a very crowded race. So I think, it's very hard to beat an incumbent. It's hard to beat an incumbent when you have a very crowded field. It's much better if it's narrow. But boy, oh boy, if that incumbent makes an unforced error, lights out.
You're on mute, Evan.
Thanks a lot. We just have 1 minute. How likely do you think it is that this CLCPA and or Local Law 97 are going to be held up by the pandemic, by COVID?
Well, I'll say that the CLCPA is already being impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. As I mentioned in my presentation, the law was already sort of late getting out the gate in terms of setting up the advisory council. I mean, the advisory council, sorry. And so it is, impacted in that way already. And now they're having difficulty, putting together their second meeting. So there's an impact there already. The other thing is that, pretty much all of the state agencies have their attention very much focused on sort of COVID-19 response. And so that, I think, detracts in terms of both resources and then moving forward, how they actually participate in the council itself. The last thing I'll say is that, the state is, because of the shutdown, has an incredible budget gap that it is facing, and it's looming and growing. And so when we come out on the other side, will agencies have the capacity to sort of engage in the robust way that, we needed them to moving forward? I think that, many agencies are going to sadly be very challenged to, just keep staff and do things on the regular. And I think that's probably what's next to come for us. So, we'll really hopefully need to see something from the federal government in terms of support to states And if we don't, the new New York could be, incredibly challenging. And so I think it'll have an impact on how we move forward with the CLCPA. I'm heartened that the governor is, really saying that, he's going to be being committed to addressing and tackling the climate crisis. But at some point, you're going to have very hard facts in terms of, where are the resources to get things done.
Thank you. So thank you all very, very much. And I just can't tell you how much I appreciate both Cecil and Josh just educating us. And let's get out there and vote, make some change. Thank you very much. Thanks, Greg, Harris, and Jenny, too. Over now.
Thank you.
Thank you, Evan.
Thanks.
Thank you, Josh.
Thank you, Evan. Thank you, Greg. Good to see you. Cecil. Thank you, Harris.
Bye, Greg. Bye, Harris.
Bye, take care.